Help us, Father, to understand what we're about to encounter here today. We pray that you will open our minds and our hearts to your truth. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so the last couple of sessions, I'll probably go back, probably another 2 or 3 sessions. Yep. Go back about 2 or 3 sessions. And if we were to go back 2 or 3 sessions, we're going to kind of piece everything together. So there's a flow and there's it kind of like makes sense when we look into what we're about to study. We've looked at so many interesting characters and their philosophies and how their philosophies have helped us and also challenged us as Christians as we share our faith in a world that is continuously changing and being shaped by culture, politics, events that occur in history, and so we're going to be bringing all of those things together. So you're going to, as we go through today's class, you're going to be like, oh yeah, I remember that. Oh, now it makes sense to me. Oh, now that makes sense, because we're going to be connecting everything and landing on why all of this matters. The aim is for us to try and land this class today. But it won't be able, like I'm just looking at some of the things that I've prepared. It won't happen today. It'll probably happen most definitely next week. And so I'm just going to ask you to fasten your seatbelts as we go through today's class. There's a bit of history there, but also some interesting facts there and some things that will really help us with Christian apologetics and how to share our faith with those who have some of these ideas, and they don't know that these ideas come from this time of history. A lot of these ideas are still here today, and I can almost guarantee that the people that you speak to don't know that their ideas stem out of these people, these individuals. And today's class is going to help us engage and how those ideas came to be. And I think it's super important for us to kind of like know and understand the origins of these ideas, why they came about, and the reason that we need to know it today as Christians. So without further ado, we're going to dive right in. Now remember, we talked about the American Revolution. We talked about the American Revolution and this person by the name of John Locke and why he's important to the American Revolution. It was his idea that they used to establish a lot of the beliefs that drove this country to revolt and to develop its own constitution. And so John Locke believed that people are born with value. And this is the idea that people have natural rights. What do I mean by that? Every person matters before the government says so. You don't get your value from the king. You don't get your value from the army, the church, or the government. You're valuable because you're a human. And these are the ideas that John Locke spoke about that really helped the American Constitution find its foundation in some of these truths. The colonists believed that God gave people life, liberty, the chance to work and flourish, their idea of happiness. And that's why the Declaration of Independence says all men are created what? Equal. All men are created equal. See, that's a theological statement, friends. It's a theological statement, even if it sounds political. This idea only makes sense if humans are not accidents. If humans are not just animals. Humans are made with purpose. That's the Imago Dei. And when you look at the Imago Dei, even when it's not written in Latin, we can see that when you say that all men are created equal, it is for the simple fact that you bear the image of God. And so the political impact America rejected absolute monarchy. They rejected divine right of kings and said power comes from where? It comes from the people. Because all people are created equal. I want you to keep these ideas in your mind as we look at the values of the American Revolution in contrast to what we're going to see in the French Revolution. And keep in mind the philosophers that shaped these ideas, that pushed these ideas, these thinkers that pushed these ideas, are the reason that we were able to establish some of this. And so that's the reason that we looked at these apologists or these philosophers. Now, the theological shift is this. Notice something subtle. God is still important. Despite everything that was happening at the time when people were beginning to question, the age of faith has been challenged. It has been stretched. They began questioning itself, not from the outside. They questioned themselves from the inside. When the Reformation began, it began because they no longer believed that those who had authority to teach the Bible actually were true and honest about it. That's the reason they challenged it. So the age of faith came to an end, and the age of reason came. And the age of reason was supposed to try and re-understand truth and ultimate reality without the church anymore. They said, well, the church failed us, and every single one of us has a mind. We should be able to discover truth for ourselves. And so the age of faith transitioned into the age of reason. And what you're about to discover here is the age of reason is about to transition to the age of enlightenment. Okay? And so this theological shift, God is still important, but God is no longer tied to a king. This protects people from abuse, but it also moves God slightly out of politics. That tension is going to grow later as we look. So John Locke says that no one should be forced to believe. This is John Locke's Religious Liberty and Toleration. Again, Thomas Jefferson was inspired by John Locke. And so a lot of the founding fathers were inspired by what John Locke taught. And they came to believe that you cannot force someone to love God. The colonists believed faith must be free, worship must be chosen, and the government should not control churches. Governments should not control churches. That's why different Christian groups could live together. Belief became personal, and it was not enforced in this country. Now, keep in mind, this is coming out of a revolution. Okay? And so the political impact, it led to freedom of religion and the separation of church and state. And what's important here is that this was meant to protect faith, not erase it. You see, a lot of people think that separation of church and state means to throw away the church. Separation of church and state was to distinguish church, the role of the church and the role of the state in establishing this new republic. And so the theological impact, Christianity became persuasive, not coercive, based on conscience and defended with reason and scripture. Super important. And so unfair power must be resisted. Resistance to what they would call any form of tyranny. And so the colonists believed unjust laws breaks that moral contract. And once tyranny takes over the government, the people say, all right, that government is gone. Right? The authority has limits. Rebellion is allowed when rules become destructive. Okay? So this is why they said when a government becomes destructive, it has to change. Has to change. That's straight out of Enlightenment thinking, friends. Straight out of Enlightenment thinking. Remember, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz were all age of reason going into the age of Enlightenment. John Locke and Hume were also all Enlightenment thinkers, transitioning into Enlightenment thinkers. And so this is where we get things complicated, because in Romans chapter 13 it says to submit to authority. But the American Revolution says resist tyranny. You see? So the founders believe God allows resistance to injustice. And so authority must answer to a moral law. Now, keep an eye on this, because this opens the door to later debates about what is civil disobedience. We've been on the borders here in this country looking at defining what civil disobedience looks like. It's like the worst thing that could ever happen in this country is civil war. And so you're on the borders waiting and watching whether this is tyranny. Are we seeing destruction at the moment? Is it time for a revolution? And justice versus obedience. These are debates that are ongoing even today in our universities. So reason matters a lot, okay? Public reason and common sense. That's why the power of speech in this country is super important. Speech allows us to define, speech allows us to voice and share concerns, because we need to understand these things, these issues. And so rules should actually make sense. The colonists believed that laws should be explained, powers should be reasonable, arguments should be public. And that this is why pamphlets, debates, and arguments mattered so much back then. Constant pamphlets, constant propaganda at the same time. So the apologetic impact, though, is that Christianity in America, they learned to argue, to persuade, and to reason publicly. This is what we do. This is how we handle situations, is we stand up and speak what it is that you believe. And whether I believe it or not, I will defend your right to say what you need to say. But also be prepared to be challenged when you say what you say, because faith wasn't just inherited, it was defended. But later, the same idea becomes, quote, if it doesn't sound reasonable to me, I reject it. That's the seed of modern skepticism, friends. So, the American Revolution was driven by the belief that God gives people value, governments serve people, faith must be free, and power must be limited by moral law. That's my summary of everything that we've looked at in regards to the American Revolution and the founding of this republic. But why does this matter for apologetics? It matters because America was born with Christian moral assumptions. It matters because Enlightenment reasons. It matters because of suspicion of tyranny. Who defines tyranny? How do we define tyranny? And then respect for conscience. These are the reasons that we as Christian apologists must be prepared to have these conversations, because they're happening in the schools, they're happening in our universities, they're happening everywhere, and Christians don't know how to have these conversations. And that's why Christians felt at home earlier on, but also became vulnerable later to being reduced to just personal beliefs. Your faith is okay so long as you keep it to yourself. I don't have a problem with Christianity as long as you shut up about it and keep it at your home. You see, what John Locke built, what George Berkeley protected, see, David Hume undermined it. David Hume challenged faith, challenged reason, and he challenged science. David Hume prepared the soil for atheism. He weakened any kind of miracles that you see in the Bible and destabilized science, and he forced Immanuel Kant to wake up. Immanuel Kant said, it was Hume that woke me up from my sleep, my dogmatic slumber. It was the things that, because if Immanuel Kant did not wake up and we had to submit to what Hume taught at the time, science goes out the window, faith goes out the window, reason goes out the window. Why? Here's what he said. Are we sure we really know anything at all? And this is the guy that gave way to skepticism, friends. This is the guy that challenged every thinker during his time. And he says, just because something happened before doesn't mean it can happen again. He's challenging the idea of causation. You don't actually see causes, you only see patterns, is what he said. Belief is habit, it's not actually knowledge. He says, in regards to cause and effect, an example here, he says fire makes heat, does it? And he challenged it. And he said, yes, you see fire, and then automatically after you see fire, you feel heat. And Hume says you never see fire making the heat. You only see fire, then heat. So your brain gets used to it. And why does this matter? It's because Hume says causation is not something you see, it's something that your mind expects. He says, so cause becomes a habit then, and it's expectation, it's mental association, it's not actually real. You see, he challenged the culture to the point where the culture was now looking at the things that were traditionally taught and questioning these things. This is how Hume brought skepticism into our day. This is huge for Christianity because he started questioning creation, providence, God acting in the world, all depend on real causation. And so if cause is just a habit, God's actions look no different than coincidence. And miracles become suspicious. See, Hume is doing something that people back then only dreamed to speak about. Spinoza thought about these things, Leibniz. But Hume, he went for it. Even at the risk of the church still in power around that time, he went for it. And so Hume's induction, the future will be like the past. He says, will it? The sun came up yesterday, the sun came up today. The sun will come up tomorrow is a question. Just because the sun came up yesterday, it came up today, it's not guaranteed to come up tomorrow. It's an expectation, right? And so Hume asks, why are you so sure about these things? You see what's happening here? You see how skeptics work? You can't prove it. He says you cannot prove it without assuming the future will be like the past, but that's the very thing you're trying to prove. Okay? Don't ask me any questions about this. I can't even defend this dude. So the apologetic shock is this, is if Hume is right, science rests on habit. Miracles can't be ruled, miracles can't be ruled out logically, but miracles also can't be known reliably. That's what he's saying. And so everything becomes probability and feeling, okay? So you kind of get why Kant says, I need to deal with this. But it took Immanuel Kant 11 years to just sit on it and process it. That's why a lot of people were known in their 20s and 30s, like Spinoza at a young age, Berkeley at a young age. But Immanuel Kant, later on in his 50s, he's around 56, 57 when people began to notice who he was. That's because he would chew on an idea. And he would just sit there. He says, oh, that's a brilliant idea, but how can I counter that idea? How can I rescue? So that he's looking at these claims made by Hume. And so Hume, when he talked about miracles, and this is a big hit on apologetics, as Hume argues, it's always more likely that people are mistaken than nature was broken. Okay? If someone says, I saw something impossible, he will say, people lie. Or people get confused, but nature won't lie. Right? You see how he stacked that? So he stacks the odds against miracles by default. It attacks the resurrection. It attacks biblical history. It attacks revelation as public truth. And so faith gets pushed toward personal experience, inner feelings, moral teaching. Does it sound familiar? Right? This is like the modern Western religion as we know it today. And so Hume and God, when he thinks about God, he says, you don't experience God. Hume says you experience thoughts. You experience sensation. You experience impressions, but you don't experience God. You don't experience God directly. You don't experience necessary being. You don't experience ultimate causes. So what Hume quietly does, he doesn't shout, God is dead like Friedrich Nietzsche. He whispers, we can't really know that, can you? Can't really prove it, can you? And that whisper is so powerful because it impacts us politically. Hume helps create a world where truth feels uncertain, authority feels suspect, and that tradition feels arbitrary. And this leads to skepticism towards church authority, suspicion towards dogma, and preference for tolerance over truth. And so religion becomes nice if it helps you, dangerous if it claims certainty. And that's a Hume-shaped society. This is why Hume scares everyone, including atheists. Here's the twist. Hume doesn't just hurt Christianity. He hurts science, reason, certainty, morality. If everything is habit, then why trust logic in the first place? Why trust science in the first place? Why trust moral obligation? And Hume just pulls the floor out of everyone, right? And this is why Kant has to respond, because Immanuel Kant panics. And this is key because Kant reads Hume and realizes if Hume is right, science collapses. Remember, this is the time in which the scientific revolution has just taken off. And so there's no real causation, no guaranteed induction, and no necessary laws. And so Kant says, I must save knowledge or everything falls apart. This is why Kant does what he does next. And so Kant says he needs to save knowledge. And Hume didn't prove God false. He made certainty feel impossible, which quietly prepares a culture to live without God. So, if someone dismisses miracles automatically, they're often channeling Hume. If someone says faith is just personal feeling, Hume helped teach that. And if someone trusts science but can't explain why it works, Hume is in the background of that. And so these ideas inspired this revolution in America. Good news is that America leaned towards John Locke rather than leaning towards Hume. But those who ended up leaning towards Hume brings in the French Revolution. So when we look at the French Revolution, here you see the representatives of France. They're being locked out of the meeting hall. Here's the irony. France's funds were depleted in helping the American Revolution, only to come back home to deal with their own revolution, right? And so the king, Louis XVI, doesn't want to deal with the issues that they want to address. So at Versailles, they go into the tennis court, and here at the tennis court, they swear, we will not separate until we give France a constitution. This is the real beginning of the French Revolution. What changes here is authority no longer flows from God, king, and eventually to the people. Authority flows from the people themselves. God has not been denied yet, but he is no longer necessary for legitimacy. This is the quiet theological shift that's happening in France around this time. And so what you see here is political identities are being born. Now the assembly begins to meet regularly, and seating happens naturally, by the way. People that walk into the tennis court, they began to take their seats naturally. Those would sit to the left are the ones who want to break completely with the past, king, church, and tradition. They sat to the left. And those who sat to the left believe that the old system is corrupt, tradition is the problem, the church is dangerous, the monarchy must go, and a clean break is necessary. They are driven by anger for injustice, hope for equality, and impatience is gradually growing on the left. And they said, if we don't tear it down, it will come back to haunt us. So they want to get rid of the traditions, the church, right here, right now. And so they stand, and the left increasingly sees God as tied to oppression. See, the picture says there, the right, it's left. God is tied to oppression, the church as complicit in injustice, tradition as something to overcome, and so faith becomes suspicious, and it becomes optional around this time, and equivalent to hostility. And so this here is not yet atheism, but it's anti-tradition. And so the right ends up responding, and the right side are those who want restraint, continuity, and they also want, more importantly, they want order. They believe that the old system was flawed, but it wasn't evil. Sudden change, they believe, is going to be dangerous, and society needs structure. Religion provides moral restraint, and authority must be limited, but authority must not be destroyed. Right? And so the right were driven by fear of chaos. They were driven by the fear of moral collapse and that concern for stability in the country. And so they believe if we destroy everything, we won't be able to control what replaces it. And so the right tends to see God as moral anchor, tradition as accumulated wisdom, the church as imperfect but necessary. And so faith functions as restraint, continuity, and moral memory. Notice that what they wanted here is to make sure that the church is still around, because they were afraid of what could take place if they removed the church. They didn't know what to expect. They didn't know what kind of chaos was going to come if they got rid of the baby and the bathwaters, they would say. We want to get rid of Christianity, but we don't want to jump to that too soon, too quickly. That's why Voltaire, he says, if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. This is a guy that's conscious of the fact that we could end up slipping into the deep end and not know what's in the deep end. We've never been there before. And so France reaches a breaking point, and for centuries the monarchy ruled with absolute power. But the church was tied to the crown, and so God was preached, but power was abused. And so the people finally said that, we're done with you guys. We're done with the monarchy. And not just done with the king, done with the entire system that claimed authority, which is God himself. And so this, for them, is not reform. This is a rejection of anything that is Christianity. And so the age of enlightenment comes to the scene. So you got the age of faith transitioning to the age of reason, and the age of reason now gives way to the age of enlightenment. And the French revolutionaries believed something new. We don't need God anymore. We have reason. They had read the philosophers. They had absorbed enlightenment mood. They believed humanity had come of age. Faith, they said, belongs to the past now. You see the difference, the contrast between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and the ideas that drove the French Revolution and ideas that drove the American Revolution. Reason, they say, belongs to the future. And so they make a decision. Faith has to go. And so there's this movement, They say that faith has to go. And so there's this movement of cleansing the faith. So what happens next is not just symbolic, it's physical. The churches are burned. That huge church in France was the cathedral known as the Notre Dame, that was destroyed and replaced with the goddess of reason. These churches were burnt, Bibles were destroyed. Adventist theology says that Revelation 11 occurs in alignment with what's happening here in France. Bibles are destroyed, clergy were executed or driven out, Christian calendars are abolished, and weeks are rewritten, and Christian festivals are all erased because France is not looking for neutrality. This is a purge, and France is not trying to separate church and state. France is actually removing God from public life. And that's where we see the goddess of reason, Mithra, which is kind of ironic, right? Because when you remove God, you don't remove religion, you replace it. And France doesn't become empty, it becomes devotional in a whole new way and approach. They create this cult called the Cult of Reason, where they erected this, these statues, and they used like even a real life person at one stage, and they took her around this idea that they enthroned the goddess of reason, which is a symbolic female figure, often portrayed by a real woman, placed in former cathedrals, like the Notre Dame would later become the Temple of Reason. And what's funny is that they said no more myths, but they ended up creating one. And so they said no more worship. Then they built a new altar. And this is the great human paradox. We don't stop worshiping, we just change what we worship. And that's what we saw in the establishment of what would become the French Republic. A new government is born, and God is gone. Something else has to rule. And so France builds a whole new political order. Authority no longer comes from heaven. It comes from the people, right? And so law is no longer grounded in divine morality, it's grounded in ideology. So politics becomes ultimate, and once politics becomes ultimate, this is where disagreements can become dangerous. Because politics become moral absolutes. Once God is removed, the state defines what's good and what's evil. Law replaces conscience, and power replaces restraint. The revolution begins to eat itself. And so anyone who disagrees is not just wrong, they're actually immoral, and this was the dangerous place that the French Revolution found themselves. This is how you get mass executions, ideological purity tests, fear and terror. Liberty becomes enforced, and so is violence. And so Europe learns a lesson from the French Revolution. Europe watches France, realizes something terrifying. You see, by removing God, removing God didn't bring any sort of peace. By removing God, they didn't have the prosperity that they were looking for. It actually brought chaos. But by returning to church, controlled power also is something that they try to avoid as well. And so the question becomes, how do we keep reason, morality, and freedom without religion ruling politics? Isn't that a good question? And without atheism destroying moral order. See, this is the problem no one knows how to solve, which is why Kant is important in the discussion. Kant sees all of this. Hume has shattered certainty. France has shattered tradition. Reason has become a weapon, and faith has become a causality. And so Kant does not want religious tyranny at all, or revolutionary terror. So he tries something new. What does Kant say? In effect, he says, let's save science by limiting knowledge. Let's save morality by grounding it in reason. Let's save God by removing him from public proof and from political power. It's amusing, but it's also very fascinating how he does this. You see, this is Kant's project. He's not reacting in a vacuum. He's reacting to blood in the streets and certain violence. Because Kant is born into a world where faith has abused power and reason has spilt blood, and his philosophy is an attempt to prevent both. Okay? And so, by the way, Kant is the influence behind the American Bill of Rights and the modern international law. So now let's have a look at Kant and what he offers as a solution, because what they didn't want to see again is another revolution like the French Revolution. How Kant tries to prevent tyranny is this. He says Kant thinks tyranny happens when religion controls politics, and politics controls morality, and science claims to explain everything. So what does Kant do? He looks at all these things that he thinks is so important, but he says they have to be separate. It's known as Kant's wall. He's about to build a wall, okay? And so Kant has these three walls, known as the three fences, and put it simply, Kant divides human life into these three zones. He says science, what we can measure and study, stay in your lane. Morality is what we ought to do. Morality will have its own lane. Science will not give us morality. Morality will have its own thing. And then he says, faith, what gives meaning and hope. So Kant says faith is super important because it helps us deal with the existential crisis. And so each of these three zones have a job. None is allowed to take over the other. He builds these categories, and this is Kant's anti-tyranny strategy. Now, here's the political impact. No divine right of kings. No state-enforced religion. No ideology allowed to claim ultimate truth. Yes? Uh-huh.
They had taught the divine right of kings for centuries, which basically said anything the king has been placed there by God, so anything the king does, is God ordained, no matter how evil or tyrannical or oppressive or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'd like to observe that the thing that they were reacting against, specifically in the French Revolution, was a
Yes.
right?
Yes.
It's a completely false
Yes.
God. So their reaction against it was right. I'm not saying how they reacted,
Yes.
right? Like the mechanism was wrong, but the thing they were reacting against was correct. They were
Yes.
correct in observing that this is not the way God
Yes.
is, and we should be angry about it.
Yes.
Because there was no actual representation of who God really is in that system.
Yes.
So, like, the whole system that they had was a false system, and they react against it. Obviously, they're looking in the wrong places for that. But, we can't be too hard on the French Revolution, as terrible and horrific as it was, because realistically, looking at it from a Seventh-day Adventist perspective, with great controversy and things like that, you have Satan's system of government doing exactly what he wanted it to do, and then, oh, guess what? He gets another version of his same government reacting against it, and there's all kinds of terror and death and all of these things.
Yep.
And so, I was waiting for you to mention the divine right of kings and see if you did, but
Yeah. So what you say is super important because both the American Lafayette, who in France, he fought in for the American Revolution, went back with the same ideas to France. Both believed that the government has drifted. Both countries believed, and so both countries had the same idea but different outcomes. And like you said, like Kant believed it too, but Kant says that we could do it better. We could approach this better. Like revolutions should not be happening if people were more enlightened, is what these Enlightenment thinkers were. They were utopians. They think that things will become better. And so they're looking at these ideas as you said, like they're being misrepresented. Cool, we're not going to give you another chance.
yeah. Well, and also in America, one of the differences too is you have like Puritans escaping
Yeah.
religious persecution.
Yeah.
Whereas France, is the heart of the persecution in that sense. Whereas here in America, you have these groups who came here for the sole purpose of, freedom of religion and free expression of religion.
Yes.
And so that influences the thought process pretty significantly. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but
Yeah, but see, that's the idea is there. Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. And so in theory, this keeps power in check by putting them into their own categories. And how Kant walls off God. Here's the cost of his solution. He says, God is real, but he doesn't run things. Okay? Thinking about what Ryan had just said, he's like, even if he was misrepresented, there are some that believe that's how he's represented. As Adventists, we look at that and say, he was misrepresented. You got people that say, well, if that's God, he's good for meaning and purpose, but he needs to be kept in a closet. And so Kant says, science can't prove God. Politics can't use God. Reason can't know God as an object. So God is moved into a whole separate space. He's not going to say that God doesn't exist, because where God lives, he says, is in conscience, is in moral duty, in personal faith, and God also lives in hope. And for someone like Kant, he says the God idea is a powerful idea, same thing that Voltaire believed as well. So God is meaningful, he's necessary for morality, but not publicly knowable, right? And so that's what he does, is he walls God off. And so what Kant is afraid of is he believes if God is treated as public knowledge, people will use him to justify power. We've seen that all throughout history, friends. France taught him that fear, so Kant says God must be protected from politics, and politics must be protected from God. Again, it's the reaction, right? He's reacting. So how Kant thinks he saves God, and why this matters to us as we look into Christian apologetics. See, Kant famously says, I deny knowledge in order to make room for God. Stop fighting about proving God is what he's saying, because you don't have the ability to try and prove him. Let God ground morality instead, and let him remain in his lane and leave him there. Kant does not deny God. He just actually relocates him. And so God becomes the guarantor of moral meaning, the hope that justice matters, and the reason conscience makes sense, but not the ruler of history, he says. the revealer of public truth, the actor in miracles. That's the trade. We keep God, but by keeping him, we have to rethink our faith again and how we understand God. And so, how does this shape modern politics, though? You see, this is where Kant quietly rewires the West. After Kant, society learns that science equals facts, and politics equals power. Faith is private. It's all good to have faith, just keep it to yourself. And morality is something that's internal. And so we say things like, you can believe in God, but don't bring him into politics. That's a pure Kantian statement right there. So why modern politics feels religious now, right? Because God has been removed from the center of the arena, and now moral meaning still needs a home. And so politics absorbs this, and ultimate values, moral outrage, visions of salvation, God is removed, and now politics takes that place. And this is why political disagreement feels personal. Ideology feels sacred. Compromise feels immoral because politics becomes the substitute for religion. So, how does Kant shape secular culture? Kant gives us freedom of belief, protection from religious tyranny, and respect for science. But he also says that God as unknowable, faith as being private, and miracles as being a myth, Christianity as just ethics, but it's not true. Notice the subtle changes. This is the modern secular mindset that's being shaped at the same time. And so, where is Immanuel Kant wrong here? The problem first, and I shared this last week that I was going to share some problems about Kant, and I'm going to share them today, is that the problem number one is Kant still makes a godlike claim. Even when he puts God in his own ward area, he says humans cannot know beyond experience. Well, the question is, well, how does he know that? He's still making a claim, you see. And so that statement itself claims knowledge about ultimate limits, right? It's like that idea where they said to believe in God, it's like all the religions speak truth about God. One's touching this elephant on the trunk, one's touching the elephant on its tail, and they're all describing the same animal. Well, then the question is, how do they know what's the same? Who sees the animal in its entirety and says that they're all touching the same animal? Someone still has access to ultimate reality. Kant does the same mistake, is that he says that God can't be known, but at the same time, how do you know that he's not known? You are making an ultimate claim. And problem number two is this. He says that history fits his system. And Christianity is not just morality, it's God acting in history. So what does that mean? Look at creation, covenant, incarnation, and resurrection. If God exists, it's not irrational that he would reveal himself publicly. Now, Kant assumes he wouldn't. That's not evidence, friends. That's just philosophy. That's a philosophical claim. That's not evidence to prove that. And problem number three is morality points further than Kant allows. You see, if moral obligation is real, binding, not invented, then it points not just to a useful God, but to a real moral lawgiver who stands above us. And Kant only stops halfway. That's the problem with Immanuel Kant's ideas. And so, three important facts about Kant's philosophy that I think we need to understand is number one, Kant tried to save society by limiting God and ended up teaching society how to live as if God were optional. Two is Kant built fences to stop tyranny, but those same fences slowly turned God into private guest instead of the public truth. And then finally, Kant saved science and morality, but at the cost of making God feel somewhat distant. So, Why does this matter for Christian apologetics? Christian apologetics today is speaking to Kant-shaped minds, friends. It speaks to Kant-shaped politics, and it speaks to Kant-shaped secularism. And this is why we, as Christian apologists, must reunite fact and meaning, defend historical revelation, and show that faith is not irrational, and place God above politics, not locked outside of politics. And so, how do Christian apologists or apologetics answers the Kant project, or reuniting fact, meaning, and history, and God? And one of the things we have to look at is Kant taught the West to say, you can believe in God, but you can't know God the way that you know facts. Christian apologetics responds like this: some truths are not laboratorial truths or facts, but they are still public, they're still rational, and they're still historical. For example, first move is to accept Kant's humility, right? That not all things are knowable about God. Yes, we understand that. We only know what God reveals to us. So we can agree humans are limited, but we disagree that God has to stay hidden. Christian apologetics accepts that we are not God, reason has limits, arrogance leads to tyranny, but this is what we're going to reject. We're going to reject the idea that God cannot reveal himself. We're going to reject the idea that history can't carry truth, the idea that faith must stay private. Kant draws a fence. Christianity has to ask the question, who put the fence there? Who put the fence there, followed by what gives you the right to put the fence there? And so the resurrection, God steps into history, and this kind of breaks the whole Kantian system, which is Christianity doesn't start with ideas, it starts with an event. Christianity says God is not hidden, God is not private, and God is definitely not abstract. God acted not in someone's feelings, not in moral intuition, but how did God act? In history. And so why does this matter? It matters because Kant says God can't be known as a public fact. History can't deliver God. And Christian apologetics replies with, if God exists, it's not irrational for him to act in history, just by definition. And so the resurrection is not a scientific experiment, a private feeling. The resurrection is actually a historical claim with witnesses, with consequences, and it has a public proclamation, which means that the early Christians didn't just say, hey, we found meaning. The early Christians said that God raised Jesus from the dead, making it a truth claim. And so let me just land here. The historical knowledge is real knowledge. This is what Kant underestimates. We know many real things from history. See, because you don't prove Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, nor can you prove Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, or that you can prove that the French Revolution happened with math equations. Right? How do you know? You know them from testimonies. You know them from documents, multiple witnesses, and best explanations of evidence. This is what we consider rational knowledge, which goes against everything that Kant spoke about in terms of what God can do in our history. So looking at the time, we're going to have to pause it right here, and we'll continue again next week. Thank you for being with us. May God bless you, and let me pray. Father in heaven, thank you so much for being with us in our class here today, and I just pray, Lord, that you will continue to help us to understand and to know the world that we have been called to be missionaries in. And I pray, Father, that you will teach us to rely and be dependent on you